Hello everyone, and welcome to your 55th Cocoa programming tutorial. In this tutorial and over the next few, I'm going to be covering how we can work with drag and drop as it relates to view-based NSTableViews. Now, I'm going to talk here for like 2 minutes to give a little rundown, but bear with. So if you're interested in drag and drop from an NS outline view perspective, which I know some people are, so figured I'd mention it, a lot of this code comes from Apple's TableView Playground source code. Now, in that source code, they implement drag and drop for NS outline views. They don't do it for NSTableViews, so I figured I'd try my hand at that. They don't really have a complete implementation. There's some things missing. For example, you can't simply move items you can't move multiple items. You can only copy multiple items, so that's kind of a downfall. I think they probably just were cheating on it, but nonetheless, it's source code, so you can't expect everything. So like I said, if you go through this series of drag and drop for NSTableView and you want to know more about the NS outline view side of things, I probably won't do a tutorial on it, so just check out Apple's source code, and that should be, it's going to be pretty close, both mine and its, so hopefully that'll guide you through it. With all that being said, my source code is probably not perfect because, like I said, they didn't implement it for NSTableView, and I haven't really seen an implementation anywhere of this. So my implementation might be absolutely horrible, but I will try to demonstrate it. So it's not easy, but we'll go through it. All right. So what are we covering in this tutorial? We're covering dragging out from NSTableView. So we're going to cover dragging a cell, either a group or a image cell, from the table view onto the Finder, for example. On top of that, I'm also going to implement the new row button so that it actually uses an NS Open panel to import items to it. So that's something you can look at there, and that's this tutorial. The next tutorial, or the next couple tutorials, however that works out, will be about moving the items, so reordering items in the NSTableView, and also dragging items from other sources like the Finder into the table view. So that's the grand roadmap ahead. All right, let's talk about drag and drop. So if you are working with drag and drop on the Mac, essentially how this works is you work with NS Pasteboard items, or you write to the Pasteboard or read from the Pasteboard. So the Pasteboard is sort of this generic object that holds on to information about items you're dragging around or copying, and then when you go to use it somewhere else, then you can take that information from the Pasteboard. So that's the general idea of drag and drop. Now, how we can implement this is by using two different protocols. One is the NS Pasteboard writing, the other is the NS Pasteboard reading. So NS Pasteboard reading is when you want to take objects from your application and write them out to the Pasteboard. So if you want to drag something from your table view into the Finder, for example, you want to work with the writing version. If you're bringing stuff into your table view, you'll want to implement the NS Pasteboard reading. Alright, so in this example, we're just going to implement NS Pasteboard writing because we're only dragging out in this tutorial, so that's that. I should also mention that this tutorial, in case you didn't know, is from previous tutorials. So all this source code is from a buildup of the past 3 tutorials, so 51, 52, and 53, and I still have 53 on there, but it's less than 55 at this point. So anyway, that's where all this source code is coming from, in case you didn't know. Alright, so we're going to implement NS Pasteboard writing, and we go over to an implementation section. This is in the desktop entity object, and we want to implement stuff. So !mark NS Pasteboard writing, and that's just for code organization. It's a useful way to separate different things, so that's the only reason I wrote that. So let's implement this protocol. And what's in this protocol? Well, to figure out, you could option click on anything ever, and you can go find it in the documentation. So there's 3 methods. The required ones aren't actually these ones. They're that one and that one, but whatever. Apple's I think just screwed up on the reference here. But anyway, the important thing about reading documentation is to figure out a lot of stuff, but if you notice in this overview section, they tell you that the Cocoa framework classes NSString, NSAttributed-string, and NSURL implement this protocol. The important one there being NSURL, and there's a bunch of other ones, but we're working with that file URL in those desktop entity objects, and so we want to be able to take that file URL and write that to the Pasteboard. So because NSURL already implements this for us, our job's pretty easy because we just have to return that. So awesome. So go ahead back into desktop entity.m and we'll implement these. So the first one we can do is writing options for type Pasteboard. And again, like I'm saying, we don't actually have to do anything. And we can just pass this on to the URL. So writing options for type Pasteboard. And in case you're curious on what this one represents, it basically means that there's kind of two options for writing to the Pasteboard. There's either telling the Pasteboard that we're giving you all the information right now, or sort of a lazy way, which is we can give you a reference and when you need it, you can fetch the information. That's, I don't know, that's sort of how that works. I don't know all the details on that one, so that's my poor explanation, I guess, of it. All right, this one is writable types for Pasteboard. This returns an array of all the types that you're writing. So again, we're going to return the URL, and the URL will tell it basically what it is. So Pasteboard. So if you were implementing something else, you might want to throw in special types to the Pasteboard to let it know that it's this type. But because you're working with file URLs, it's really easy. Like if it's a folder, right, then the file URL knows it's a folder, and so it can return that. So that's kind of the use of the writable types. It just tells you what types you're actually putting into the Pasteboard. The last one is the Pasteboard property list for type. Now this takes the types essentially that you just told it that you are going to have, and if something else wants to know about these types, then it can, I should say that this is really just you're returning a property list that represents all the types that you just had. So you're returning self.fileURL and Pasteboard property list for type. So again, this is when the Pasteboard goes to take this, it'll take a property list, and essentially if you go to read information from the Pasteboard, it can look at this property list and look at for a specific type, hey, we've got this information for this type, and you can read it from there. So this is a pretty bad explanation of all the Pasteboard stuff, but I haven't covered NSPasteboard, and I didn't really feel like going into that for these tutorials. But if you want a separate tutorial on NSPasteboard, there's tons to learn for NSPasteboard. So that could be a separate tutorial series altogether. All right. So yeah, that's everything. That's everything that we had to do for NSPasteboard running, was those three methods. So now that we have that, basically we need to do a few more things. So we need to tell the table view that essentially we can drag stuff. So to do that, we say set dragging source operation mask for local. What this means is it tells you what possible operations you can do. So NSDrag operation is basically just an enum that has a bunch of values, and if you want to support all dragging operations, you can just pass in NSDrag operation every. So for example, if you're an image and you are passing reference to something, you might move the image, or maybe you'd copy the image, right? And you can change these different things. Like if you hold down the Option key, you can copy something. That's a standard Mac thing. So this just allows us to basically do whatever drag operation we want to do. The for local part is whether this is only for our application or not. So if you're going outside, or if you're not local, then you would pass no, which in our case, we want to be able to drag out to the Finder, so we pass in no. If you pass in yes, you'll realize that you can't actually drop anything anywhere. Okay, with that, then we, what's the next part here? We have to implement the data source method for this. So one of the data source methods is for the Pasteboard options. So essentially anytime we're going to go drag something, the table view needs to figure out, okay, what am I going to return when I start dragging items, right? If I drag this cell, then what happens? So we need to basically give it the information from our entity object because it contains all that information. So that's what this method's for. Okay, where do I find this one? This one is this one. So table view pasteboard writer for row. And as you can see, it returns an object that conforms to NSPasteboard writing. Conveniently, we just set up our desktop entity object to conform to this, and that was obviously on purpose. So that's why we did that. So all we have to do is ask our table contents, since this method tells us the row that it's looking for, right? So table pasteboard writer for row, and we just return the object at that row. Because our entity objects implement NSPasteboard writing, then it's good to go. All right, so that's everything you need to do, and you have a full-fledged application that can drag stuff from it to other places. So not too bad. So we can go ahead and drag this, and we get this nice little animation even for dragging this out. The animation doesn't actually come from what we just implemented. The only thing we really get is the fact that we can pick up an item and drag it over here. We can pick up multiple items as well, so we can drag a bunch of them and drag them into the Finder like that. So, you know, there's a bunch of different things you can do, but yeah, that's that. So I was just going to try to explain why it does that animation, but the reason it does that is because we used NSTableViews in this. So because we used NSTableViews, NSTableView implements the drag. It has a way of giving back the dragging components because we linked it to its image view and its text view. So because it knows that information, it can actually animate those and return those as dragging components. Again, that's more complicated, but if you want to look into dragging components, we'll even talk about those more in the coming tutorials. But that's just essentially where this comes from. Is NSTableView has a bunch of dragging components that it knows about the image view and the text view, so it can animate those things. All right, so excellent. We have everything we wanted. Okay, let's go and implement the last part of this, which is this insert new row option, which we were talking about before. So basically, we don't want to return this dictionary object anymore. We want to actually have an NSOpenPanel appear when we do all this. So obviously, we want to make not an NS object, we want to make an NSOpenPanel. So we can call it OpenPanel. And to make one, you just ask the NSOpenPanel for an open panel. All right, excellent. So now we have if I say open panel one more time, you guys are going to go crazy. But if we have an open panel, we can set a bunch of things on it. So for our example here, all we want to allow for import is images. Now, if we really wanted to be technical, we could like allow folders and stuff, but we're not going to be. We're just going to allow images. So you could try, as a fun exercise for yourself, you could actually try and allow everything and just, well, you know, sort through what you have. So you can do that. It's really not much more difficult, but for this, I'll just show you a few neat things about the open panel. So we want to allow it to select multiple items, but we also want it to allow specific file types. So when we say set allowed file types, this is kind of a nice option if you really only want to allow specific things. So what this allows us to do is say if we only want image types, well, we can get that array of image types from NSImage. So NSImage has the method image types, which returns all the UTIs associated with image types. So that's good. So that'll only allow the open panel to select specific things. In case you don't know what an open panel looks like, it's anytime you hit open, basically. This is essentially an open panel, and you can open various things. All right, so there we go, the open panel. We've done a bunch of things, and now we just have to start it up. So we can do this with the begin sheet for window. This is the one I want. Begin sheet modal for window, and we just pass in the window. So because we're in the app delegate, we have that reference to our window. So we can just say self.window. And then we have a completion handler, which is a block. Yeah. So what does this do? Begin sheet modal for window will create a modal sheet, which means it'll pop out of the window that you tell it to pop out of, basically, and it'll be modal. So instead of this one, which isn't, basically you can drag this thing around, and you could, well, I guess it's actually, I don't know, I guess it's technically modal, but it doesn't do the same thing, essentially. It won't appear as a sheet from the window that you specify. So you'll see how this one works in just a bit. This is the fairly common version of the open panel running. Anyway, so what does this completion handler mean? Well, this is what happens when you either hit the cancel or the OK button on your open panel. So we can check the result. So if the result is that we hit the NS OK button, then we are going to want to accept a bunch of files. So that's what we want to do. So NSOK button, if that was selected, then we want to figure out all the files that we are selecting, and then we want to add those to the table view. We can get all the URLs that were selected, so we can say NSArray URLs, and we can get this from the open panel and using its URLs method. Alright, so then we can just go to a for in loop if we want and iterate through all these URLs. So go URL, in URLs, and there we go. So what do we want to do for when we set this up? Well, the first thing we want to do is actually figure out where our selection index is. So that's where we can copy this code over here. So we want to figure out, of course, what was selected, because if we have something selected, we want to put the items beneath that selected item. So that's what we're doing here. Again, this was explained in a previous tutorial. So as we go through these URLs, we want to create entity objects. So we can say desktop entity gets desktop entity, and we'll use our little convenience thing here, even though we're really only specifying, we're only really specifying images, but just to be safe, we'll use this method anyway. Again, we should check to see that the entity object actually exists. And actually, I don't know if I ever mentioned this, I don't think I did, but somebody in a previous tutorial mentioned that when we were actually adding all the objects to the table view, we should be checking to make sure that the entity object doesn't come back nil. And in our case, it shouldn't ever come back nil because we have this very specific URL. But if you were using a URL that you don't know what's in it, then you'd want to check to make sure that you actually get a folder or an image back, or else you get nil. So before you add a nil entity to your table contents, which will crash, then you should check to make sure that it's actually a desktop entity class. Anyway, that's a little side note, but that's what we're testing for here. So if it is, good, and we'll throw it onto the stack. So add it on, and what we want to do is add it, of course, to our table view as well. So we'll copy this out, throw it in there, and if all goes well, then we'll implement our index like so. Alright, so with that, the last few things that we have to do are figure out where our begin and end updates are going to go. So if we have multiple objects, for example, we want to insert them all at the same time. We don't want to have a bunch of ones inserting consecutively, so we want to specify begin and ends updates. So we can do that right before our we can really do it anywhere, but we'll just throw it right before our for loop here. So we'll say begin updates there, and we can make sure at the end of the for loop we call end updates. You always have to call end updates. And like I said, this will just mean that instead of inserting the rows every time this is called, if you put it between the begin and ends updates, it'll insert all the things at the same time. So that's a good way to do that. And then we can just scroll to that index at the very end if we want, like that. So that's something else we can do. Alright, so that should be everything. And I'm going to fix a few things here though. We have insert our entity object, it's not called obj anymore, and we got to put our semicolon down there as well. Alright, so we should be set as far as I can see. So we can go ahead and run this, and if we hit new row, we can see that's the open panel. It's running modally inside the window, as you noticed. We only select certain things, so you'll notice that certain files can't be actually selected, only images can be selected. And so if I select these images, you'll see that I have these images now. So if I scroll somewhere else, let's say I select this one, and I want to put these two images in, then it'll go below the thing as well. If you actually want to see that animation, our little thing is kind of hiding that animation, so maybe I'll select something else down here, but as you can see there, it has that little animation that comes down from that index. Alright, so that's everything that I want to cover for this tutorial. If you have any other questions, feel free to leave your questions in the comments section below. Please subscribe to the channel, and I will see you hopefully in some upcoming drag and drop tutorials. See you then.